Welcome to another episode of our podcast. We will be doing this podcast in English and talking about the recent protests in the US and around the world. So, as you all know, protests have erupted in the US around the Black Lives Matter movement. Some cities have also been plagued with riots. This is all after the George Floyd murder that was caught on camera. My main takeaways from the events that have occurred are the following. Firstly, I want to talk about the media and political hypocrisy. After months and months of fear-mongering coronavirus, people weren't allowed to go to church or have funerals. Dads were not allowed to see their newborns. Some cities were under full lockdowns. Many small businesses went bankrupt and millions lost their jobs. Anyone who protested these regulations was portrayed as selfish, and they were told that they should stay home and save lives. The same people who uttered these sentiments are the ones applauding and commending the protests and some riots. It is a weird time we live in where lawful small business owners who want to make a living for themselves and their workers are deemed selfish and dangerous, but those causing chaos and destroying those businesses are deemed, justice warriors and heroes.
Now, of course, I think that the main issue for the protests is police brutality. The police's main job is to ensure security and safety for everybody. And for George Floyd to die the way he did, in that inhumane way, under the knee of a police officer, is both enraging and frustrating, to say the least. However, we would be lying to ourselves not to recognize the taste of racism in this case. Personally, I can't see a white man being murdered by the police in the US for the forgery of a $20 note. The murder of George Floyd didn't start the protest. It was the accumulation of hundreds of cases of racism that sadly still exists today. For African Americans, when they hear a story like Floyd's, it makes them uncomfortable and scared, as the same thing could happen to them. Nobody should experience fear or feel less because of the color of the skin they were born with.
My second takeaway from the events is regarding the Black Lives Matter movement itself. The whole premise of the movement is that Black people are being hunted by the police and murdered on the streets strictly and only because of their race. Before I get into the police aspect, firstly, in the US, there are about 7,000 Black victims of homicide a year. That number is crazy. That rate is comparable to countries that are at war and crime-infested third world countries. We do not expect to see it in a developed country as the US. Out of the 7,000 Black people murdered a year, 6,550 are murdered by other Black people. That is around 94% of them. So why is it Black lives only seem to matter only when there is an incentive for the media to capitalize on headlines that fuel masses and sell papers and clicks online? In the weekend following of George Floyd's murder, 24 people were killed in Chicago, mostly Black people. One was 3 years old and 4 teens. No one can recite their names, not one protest, not one angry politician, nothing. And this has been going on for years in places like Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore. If these people really cared about Black lives, that would be their number one cause.
Okay. Like I said, I understand why you disagree, but like we said, the main issue is police brutality. And it happens to both Black people and people of other color, but still, like, a problem like racism, it shouldn't happen today in this modern age. And I'd expect it's time for change. That's why people are out there protesting, and I'd expect the same if a Muslim was the one killed, if a white man or whoever died in that inhumane way that happened in front of a camera.
Well, I think I was just tackling the Black Lives Matter aspect, but I think as well there have been many white people who were killed by police and caught on camera. For example, like you probably didn't even hear of it. Like there's a case of a man named Daniel Shaver. He owned a scope to look through, and he was showing it to his friend from a window, and someone saw it and then called the police because they thought it was a gun. And then on video, because there was about the body cam footage, they raided his room, and then he was told to follow these like crazy instructions, like the policeman told him, don't move, and then he told like don't move your knees, and then he told him to move forward or something, and then he was crying and shouting. It's a very chilling video to watch. And then the policeman shot him like 9 times or something, and the policeman he got charged, but he was found not guilty, and then he's still on the police force until now. And there wasn't any outcry because of that, and there's many cases like that.
That's interesting.
So I think it is definitely like the US has a strong, like a big problem of police brutality, but I think it's not accurate to just characterize it as a racism problem, because I'll get into the numbers in a bit. So the police kill 1,000 people a year in the US, which is pretty. Like, I think in the past 10 years, maybe in Canada there wasn't 1,000 people killed. Anyway, so that number has been consistent for a long time. So out of these 1,000 people, 370 are white and 235 are black. Like, if racism is the reason why every black person was killed by cops, then what's the reason behind white people being killed? It's not reasonable to assume that every black person being killed is killed because of racism, and then white people are killed because of other reasons. So even at those numbers, when you control for population and crime rates, white people are more likely to be killed by a cop in the US. And there was a study that found that black cops are more likely to kill black people than white cops. So I think it's more of a police brutality issue than a race issue. Obviously, the situation is all more nuanced. Black neighborhoods are more policed than white ones, but it's always essential to look at crime rates. For example, 100%, almost 100% of police killings consist of men, and 0 are women. Is it reasonable to conclude from that there is inherent sexism against men by police? It's important to look at the reasons for these stats, always. It's also important to note that these cities are more haunted by crime and police brutality, are all run by Democratic and majority people of color. Since the 60s and 70s, the police chiefs, the mayors, they're mostly they're all Democrats and mostly people of color. And if not, they're voted in by majority people of color. So I think the issue for the black community is much deeper than just racist cops and people who are out to get black people. This has been a narrative pushed by politicians since President Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s, and has been accepted by the masses. I think it's used to gain votes and control these cities and make them dependent on government support. For example, the single motherhood rate in the 60s, which was a time that was much more racist than now, was 25% among the black community. So for every 4 black people growing up in America, one of them grew up without a father. So today it's 70%. That's partly because it's incentivized by the government through welfare systems. So even Obama said children grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. In my opinion, it's the goal of the Democratic politicians to have these communities depend on governmental welfare in order to make them easy votes in the future. Both parties have been culprit in this. The famous war on drugs by Bush and Reagan, which was spouted, to help get rid of drugs in America, it was heavily disproportionately affected black and other people of color. So I think it's important to keep nuance when talking about this issue, and not to make it as simple as just white cops out to get black people who are just,
Yeah, this is interesting, like you said, but it's important. Like, now is the time for change. Now it's wrong to ignore the systematic racism that's not only happening in the US, but in many countries outside the US. So it's never wrong to protest that. It's never wrong to look at other topics, also other issues like the Palestinian issue, the conflicts happening in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. It's always Uyghur Muslims in China, the concentration camps. It's important to always protest any injustice happening anywhere in the world. And I think I read was that the wage gap only decreased once in the US through its history between black people and white people, and that was in the 60s. Imagine, that's 60 years ago.
But I think it's also not completely accurate to look at the results that people accumulate, for example, their wages. Because, for example, Asians in the US who have been heavily discriminated against through history, so like some were put even in camps during the World War II, and they're living in extreme poverty, today have the highest median income among all races. So I think it's not completely fair to look at just the results that different groups of people accumulate and then, regard that to racism or whatever.
In terms of the looting and the protests, I understand why sometimes protests can become violent. However, some of the looting and vandalism that happened can't be justified. I mean, some of the shops looted belong to small shop owners who put the sweat, tears, and blood in their business. Some of the shop looted even belong to black owners, which doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, I think it's doing more harm to the black communities when you loot places in your community. It's going to discourage other businesses from opening in your community. So I think, but most of these people looting are just taking advantage of the situation, not really caring about the issue. And so to discuss the issue from international perspective and maybe a bit outside of the US, we have a guest with us. Would you like to introduce yourself, Ridwan?
Good evening, boys. I'm Ridwan. My mum and dad are actually from the island of Mauritius. I don't know if many people know where that is, but it's a very small island off the south of Africa. I was actually born up in Britain, and I feel like there's a lot to say on this matter. There's a lot of people who are expressing opinions all around the world, and I feel like it'll only help if people around the world are educated on what I feel like is the right things to be educated on. If you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. So, like we said, like places such as Britain, where there isn't as much police brutality as we see in the US, why are people protesting here? What do they want?
So I think, well, firstly, in the UK, we're seeing a lot of people, moving towards, moving together for this Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm all for it, and I love seeing people come together, trying to make a change. I think from the UK's point of view, it's one is showing solidarity with the people in America, and two, I feel like, in the UK, I'm not going to lie, that in terms of police brutality, it's not near the level in America, because police simply don't have the power as or power controls that they do in America to enforce that upon people in the UK. So in terms of the UK's problem, in terms of my own opinions about this, or I'm personally, and I feel like there's a lot of other people in the UK as well, kind of just fed up of how this whole race, I can't even explain it, but I think it's time that we want to see change in the way things are taught to us, because I truly believe there's been a huge misrepresentation of the impact of ethnic minorities and how they've helped Britain to be the country that it is today. My island, Mauritius, was colonized back in the 18th century, 19th century by Britain, and it was only gained independence back in 1968, and that's one island out of how many other countries they colonized. For me, anyways, I feel like we just need to educate colonialism in schools and get people, to realize what these ethnic minorities and what people of color effectively have, brought to this country.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about colonialism, so what impact do you think it had on people of color in England living today?
I think from the there's always been this kind of ancient view that immigrants are lesser, maybe not lesser people, but bring lesser skills to your country than people who are brought born and bred in, let's say Britain, for example. And I feel like that is, one of the biggest misconceptions of our time. Because if I'm honest, modern Britain today would not be the country that it is without, all these people that have come into this country, whether they may be from Nigeria, Ghana, Mauritius, India, wherever, because these people bring so much with them: culture, language, cuisine, all these things. And I don't feel like there's a proportion of people in this country that don't acknowledge that whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the UK doesn't have the same historical context as in terms of slavery as in the US, yet there was like that news that the UK was still paying slave owners until 2015.
Yeah, so I think it's 2015 was the last payment of reparations. So the UK actually amounted to spend £20 billion in slavery reparations towards slave owners, and I personally believe that's inexcusable for any government.
Reparations for people who used to own slaves, or since they lost that economic benefit.
Exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that has I've read about today that's really annoyed me is obviously we know about the Edward Colston statue that was toppled back in, I think it was last month, or was it maybe earlier this month, in Bristol. And obviously the police are now launching their investigation into trying to find the criminals and prosecute them and so on. But that just it kind of raised a question in my mind: when will all these families who have been impacted by this whole slavery issue, when will they ever face it? When will they ever get justice? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
When will those people get justice? Why are the people who are effectively trying to raise awareness about this whole issue, why are they being punished for it? You know what I'm saying?
So since you mentioned statues, obviously the big one is Winston Churchill. There's been lots of conversation about him.
Yeah.
What do you think? What's your opinion on judging historical figures by today's more standards? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, Churchill, I wanted to say the things he said. And so Churchill, who's considered, even though he's considered an English hero, but Churchill, when talking about Zionists occupying Palestine, described it as natural for a superior race to dominate an inferior one. He was also responsible for the Bengal famine, yet blamed the Indians for breeding like rabbits. He also advocated the use of chemical weapons against whom he called uncivilized tribes when attacking Afghans. So I must ask, as an individual, what makes him better than Hitler, for example?
Well, I would say in terms of the protests, the people who are without Winston Churchill, they wouldn't even have the right to protest if they were under Nazi rule or what. So I don't think it's particularly fair. Even people who we may see as heroes today, in the Middle East or wherever, in 10 or 20 year time, according to those standards, they may be seen as bad people. So I think it's always better to keep the nuance, to keep nuance in these topics, and you can't question the fact that he is a big part of British history.
Exactly.
So even if you disagree with some of his politics.
I personally, I think, as Ahmed just, gave examples of the, things he said, many of us today in the modern day would not agree with the things he said, but we have to also realize, back in the last century, it was a completely different way of thinking, wasn't it? We had completely different attitudes. The world wasn't as developed as it was. Globalization hadn't happened. If I'm honest, it hadn't, to the level it has today. Sorry. And I personally believe it's near impossible to, erase a prime minister from British history. You can't. It's as much as people would love to do that, you can't, because that man won World War II. That man literally defeated the Nazis, and you can't erase that from British history by taking a statue down. You're effectively taking away all of that from British history, and that's just
I
not
think
right, in my opinion. And it's a very complex issue. It's a complex question.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's easy to look at him like a person in a vacuum and judge him like that.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
you always have to take him in his context and
Yeah,
compare him to his to his counterpart, which is not a very pleasant man.
Yeah. And again, where do we draw the line? Like Gandhi was considered, who is considered a symbol of peace, is both a racist and a sexual predator.
Yeah, I think like anyone's heroes, maybe like Mother Teresa, anyone can be looked at in a light that would make him bad. So I don't know, like when it comes to historical figures, to people who are not alive now, I think it's always best to just keep them as history and learn from their mistakes and not to diminish their accomplishments.
I just think on this whole statue, this whole issue about statues, it's very easy for someone to just say, "Oh, let's get rid of this person because he said this and he said that." But as I said before, we have to contextualize each scenario. We did live in different times back then, and that obviously I'm not saying in any kind of way, shape, or form that what Churchill or what Gandhi did was acceptable. It wasn't. Especially what Gandhi did was, I don't know how a man got away with so much, if I'm honest, and is still viewed by many around the world due to the lack of education about this stuff as as a man of peace and so on. Churchill, on the other hand, he was you can be seen as a war hero, but he also had some questionable opinions about things, and obviously, but how am I gonna say tear down the statue of a prime minister who effectively saved this country from Nazism, because he did. Whether you like it, he did save the country. You can't erase all that, and that's why I'm impartial in this statue kind of. But in terms of this, in terms of slave owners having their statues on, for example, Edward Colston, there's another slave owner statue in Oxford University. I'm not too sure know his name, but he actually transported slaves from the West Indian coast down to Africa, and maybe could well have done transport slaves to my island back in Mauritius. And I'm all for getting those statues down, because if anything, taking those statues down raises more awareness about this whole issue than keeping them up, and that's a fact.
So this may be a bit far away from the topic, but for example, like statues in the U.S. of like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, who are definitely they were slave owners. But as well, their writings and the laws that they pushed played a big role in then ending slavery in the U.S. as well. So, like, what would you say about their statues? Also, you have to mention that they are founders of the U.S. So we did see statues, I believe, of both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington being toppled in the U.S.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
But exactly, that's the thing though about statues, is they're meant to act as a signal to history in a way, don't they? And as much as people can have their opinions about it, history is history. What's happened has happened. Having a statue up may actually, and maybe in terms of the American case, may actually say, okay, look, in America this stuff happened. We're aware it did happen, and we're keeping the statue up to show this was part of our history. We're not trying to hide our history, because if anything, that would be a bit more sketchy, wouldn't it? Be a bit more weird. Imagine if I don't know, the US or the UK decided to completely eradicate all forms of evidence that they had that they were effectively had a major role in the slave trade.
Like as they say, I think it's the quote goes, if you don't learn your history, you're bound to repeat it.
Exactly.
So I think it's important to learn about the mistakes of the people who we consider to be historical figures.
Yeah, I agree with that one. So Nelson Mandela actually said, effectively he said, no one is born a racist. You kind of learn to hate, don't you? And that's one thing that kind of got me wondering, especially from the UK's point of view. I can't really have an opinion about life in the US, because I've not been there at all. I've not had the experience of seeing what I can read all I want, and I can watch videos all I want, but I've not personally experienced any sort of racist that's in the US. But in terms of the UK, for example, coming down to the University of Sussex, last year, and sitting there, and you see so many people from so many different origins. For example, I sit with U2 boys, and U2 boys are from Jordan. You have background in Syria, and it's amazing. I come from Mauritius, and we come collectively in Brighton, and we come together, and none of that kind of matters in a way. And that's what's so beautiful about race, because once it all comes together, it's amazing, isn't it? How you can share so many things. You've taught me. I think it was the Arabic board game you played at your house, Ahmed, one day, and I've shown you Mauritian music, and that kind of stuff is why race is so amazing. But unfortunately, there's people in this world who don't acknowledge that, and I personally feel that's at fault because of the lack of education towards this kind of stuff. In the UK, I think we're very, the UK is at fault for that. Is that a major fault for that? In history, GCSE, A levels, I don't think there's much to be said about the slave trade and what actually happened during the times of the British Empire and colonialism. There's not much to be said.
Yeah, just as you said, people are taught to be hateful. They're not born hateful. They can also be untaught these things.
Exactly.
So I think that's what the focus should be on. Not to, like, if someone's been taught this is normal their whole life, they won't ever stop being that way if they're just attacked for it and cancelled for it from their job. It should be more of an educational process. Yeah,
and I think that's the main where this whole thing stems from, really, because if people are taught from a very young age, about how how beautiful different races can be, instead of having this idea that one race is better than the other and so on, and that from that you can create so many different problems, as we've seen in the US. And the UK is not as bad in the US in terms of its police brutality, even in its judiciary system. It's not as bad as the US, and I personally feel the UK is developed more socially than the US. But we're not escaping the fact that there is a serious lack of education about this stuff in the UK. And I'm very happy people are protesting about this stuff in the UK. But I was also going to say, in terms of this Black Lives Matter movement as well, I'm all for it. But in terms of going on social media and everything, it could be also seen that a lot of people are just jumping on this bandwagon because it's what's popping, isn't
Trending.
it? Yeah, exactly. It's what's trending, and if you're doing it, I'm doing it. But I think the only thing people should be doing, and if they want to actually make this difference, is educate themselves about what essentially colonialism did, what the slave trade was, how it impacted all these people, and how the impacts are still being felt today. For example, £20 billion of our economy was going to slave owners for God knows how many years. It's ridiculous. It's just not. It's not on. And I feel like the government does need to answer questions about that kind of stuff. But then that also becomes a more systematic problem, because we're looking at a problem that's deep rooted. In terms of the education system, how is the government going to reform the education system? It becomes a bigger problem that we all think it is. I think on social media and so on, we can feel like we can sign one petition and our job's done for the day. But effectively, we need collectively all of us to realize that race is amazing in a way. It's as I've said this so many times today, but it really is. And we need to kind of come together for that point and realize that we are one people. In terms of my own history, Mauritius is a very culturally diverse place that many people are, different mix of many things. But just looking at them from my color of skin, I've been called so many things just for that. And I think that's one person. There's millions of people who've probably in the same position as me. And it's not a sympathy thing. It's not, a sad thing or anything like that. I think it's just, let's actually make this change for once. And we can actually come together, educate ourselves. But then again, it becomes a massive problem because you've got so many people in America, for example, go to Texas, go to the Midwest, and you're going to be surrounded by people who, truly, I'll say this in a civilized way, who truly believe that one race is superior than another. And how do you combat that? And that becomes a different problem, because that's across the pond. That's in America. And how do we combat that?
As Ridwan mentioned, it's funny how media works. It feels like the coronavirus has blown over, even though the numbers are still the same. Like, I went to the beach last week and people were over each other. I went to the park and played five-a-side with strangers. It's ridiculous to see how people react to what the media thinks should be trending. For example, now it thinks it's important to address the Yemeni issue, for example, which has been happening since
It's been a problem for
2014.
years, the Yemen problem. Yeah. This is why I think it's very important to, be very kind of, how do I put this, to be very careful with this Black Lives Matter movement and supporting it, because it's very easy these days on social media to jump on that bandwagon, isn't it? You see someone post something.
When it's out of the headlines, it's just, it's gone.
Exactly, it's gone and you never hear about it ever again.
Yeah.
And, in terms of this Yemen problem in particular, I was reading about this back in 2015 and I was thinking, wow, how is this even happening? I was in a geography lesson and my geography teacher was actually telling me about it, and I was like, whoa, this isn't real. And then you've got the whole issue in Palestine, in Israel, which is a completely another debate. And then obviously none of that is getting media coverage because it's all what the agenda wants to push.
Yeah.
1 week it can be one thing, and next week it can be the other. And I think it's important not to lose sight of what we're trying to achieve here. And I think for as a person of colour, what I want to see is people just, being accepted as one people.
All right. Thank you very much, Ridwan, for your time.
Thanks, boys.
We really enjoyed chatting to you.
Always a pleasure, boys.
Thank you.
Safe, boys.